Distinguished delegates, I would like to now open the second meeting of the third working group session of the multilateral assessment under the third cycle of the international assessment and review process. On Saturday, we had the multilateral assessment of 6 developed countries. All parties actively engaged in discussions with a number of excellent questions raised during that session. Today, we have another 4 parties to be multilateral assessed. To ensure effective time management of this session, the maximum time allocated to each of the parties will be 10 minutes for their oral presentation, followed by questions and answers. I will take a block of questions from several parties at once and ask the party being assessed to respond to these questions. I will give the floor to parties under assessment in this order: New Zealand, Luxembourg, Portugal and Switzerland. Please refer to the schedule on the multilateral assessment website for the order of the parties. Presenters will be able to operate the presentations via remote control from their seats, and please remember to speak directly into the microphone, as these sessions will also be webcasted. Taking this into consideration, I would like to now start today's presentation with New Zealand. I would like to invite Kay Harrison, New Zealand Climate Change Ambassador, and Cheryl Barnes, Deputy Secretary from the Ministry for the Environment, to deliver a brief presentation. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Rapporteur. Tēnā koutou katoa. I am Kay Harrison, New Zealand's Climate Change Ambassador, and I am pleased to present today as part of New Zealand's multilateral assessment, together with Cheryl Barnes, Deputy Secretary Water and Climate at our Ministry for the Environment. We will describe our national circumstances and how these relate to our greenhouse gas emissions and the targets we have set and the actions we are taking in response to climate change. This presentation uses data from our latest greenhouse gas inventory submitted in April 2019. Notably too, after extending New Zealand's ratification of the Convention and the Paris Agreement to Tokelau, we worked jointly with Tokelau to enable its inclusion in New Zealand's greenhouse gas inventory in 2017 for the first time. And I acknowledge our Tokelau counterparts here today. Our future reporting will recognise Tokelau's climate change actions, as well as its very low impact on greenhouse gases and its particular vulnerability to climate change, with atolls approximately 3 to 5 metres above sea level. In terms of our national circumstances, New Zealand is a long, narrow and mountainous country situated in the South Pacific, around 2,000 kilometres away from the nearest largest land mass, Australia. The country has a land area of 268,000 square kilometres, similar in size to Japan or Britain. There are 2 main islands, the North Island and the South Island, and a number of smaller outlying islands. The population was approximately 4.8 million at March 2017. It is projected to increase by over 40% in 2020 since 1990, and is expected to increase even further still by over 50% in 2030. Much of the population is highly urbanised. Nonetheless, population density is relatively low, with an average of 18 people per square kilometre. New Zealand is therefore a small country with an open, trade-reliant economy founded in the land sector. Our gross domestic product in 2017 was 230.5 billion New Zealand dollars, which has more than doubled since 1990. We also have a significant indigenous Maori economy worth an estimated 50 billion New Zealand dollars, which is growing faster than the economy as a whole. However, as the Maori economy is largely concentrated in primary industries, and along with other socio-economic factors and risks to cultural land, Maori are likely to be disproportionately affected by climate change. New Zealand's gross emissions contribute approximately 0.17% of the world's gross emissions. Our gross emissions have increased a little over 23% since 1990 due to strong population and economic growth, and over the same period our net emissions increased by 65%. But things are starting to turn around. The emissions intensity of our economy per unit of GDP has decreased, which means we are decoupling our emissions from economic growth. And based on current data and policies, New Zealand's gross emissions are projected to decrease gradually by 2030 to be 19.6% above 1990 levels. As illustrated on this slide, the agriculture and energy sectors are the two largest contributors to New Zealand's emissions. The energy sector accounts for around 41% of our gross emissions. Nearly half of our emissions, 48%, come from the agriculture sector, compared with an average of 12% in other developed countries. Accordingly, methane contributes 42% to our gross emissions, and by comparison, carbon dioxide contributes around 45%. New Zealand has a suite of targets to contribute to the global effort of combating climate change. We achieved our Kyoto Protocol first commitment period target to reduce emissions to 1990 levels on average over CP1. We are set to meet our 2020 target to reduce emissions to 5% below 1990 levels by 2020. Looking ahead further, we have a target under our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement to reduce our emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. This is a multi-year target managed as a carbon budget. In addition, in November 2019, we passed legislation that sets an ambitious long-term target for 2050. That target aligns New Zealand's domestic transition within the threshold of limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It aims to reduce emissions of biogenic methane to 24 to 47% below 2017 levels by 2050, including to 10% below 2017 levels by 2030, and to reduce net emissions of all other greenhouse gases to zero by 2050. This target replaces our earlier 2050 target, which was to reduce emissions by 50% below 1990 levels by 2050. We are on track to meet our 2020 target. This graph shows how we are expecting to meet our target based on the most recent available information. We are projecting our gross emissions to be 644.8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide below 1990 levels by 2020. That budget is 509.8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. We will also recognise part of our surplus from the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. We are currently projected to use 27 million of these surplus units out of a total of 123.7 million. We are also expecting our eligible forestry activities to remove 108 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent over the period. Beyond 2020, our 2030 target under our NDC will not be easy to meet. Projections suggest that our gross emissions will be around 800 million tonnes for the period 2021 to 2030. And our budget is likely to be around 600 million tonnes. Once again, this is a multi-year target managed as a carbon budget. This chart shows historic and projected emissions as we head out towards 2030. The blue blocks represent the carbon budgets. Between the green line and the carbon budget shows how much we will need to reduce emissions to achieve our target, which at this point is 145 million tonnes of abatement or sequestration over and above our current business as usual projections.
While much of a multilateral assessment reflects on past reporting, a great deal has happened since our third biennial report was published. New Zealand has put in place a number of policies and measures and is planning others to help us reduce emissions and close the gap that Kay mentioned to help us move more quickly towards our 2050 targets. A few of those developments are illustrated on this, what I appreciate is a very busy slide. It covers our latest policies and measures on mitigation, on adaptation, a just transition program, and investment and finance. I'm going to take you through some of the key parts of that program over the next few slides. Just before I do that, now is a good place to note that we found the process of reporting and preparing for this presentation very useful to examine our own reporting. And we have noticed, for instance, a few errors in our third biennial report, which includes an error in reporting our carbon budget for 2020 at one point in the document. We report at 516.68 million tonnes carbon dioxide equivalent, rather than what it should say, which is 505.8 million tonnes. So if you have questions about this, we are happy to respond here or, of course, bilaterally. Most recently, New Zealand has passed the Climate Change Response Xerocarbon Amendment Act. The Act provides a framework by which New Zealand can develop and implement clear and stable climate change policies on a path to a low-emissions, climate-resilient economy. As highlighted earlier, the Xerocarbon Act sets out a long-term emissions reduction target for 2050. The Act also establishes a system of successive emissions budgets and plans to act as stepping stones towards the target. It establishes a Climate Change Commission to provide independent advice to the government and monitor our progress towards long-term climate goals. And it also institutes a range of adaptation measures. We're also strengthening the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, which is the primary tool underpinning our domestic action to reduce emissions. Between 2015 and 2017, we carried out a review of the Emissions Trading Scheme. The review identified the improvements that are needed for the scheme to drive emissions reductions and help us meet our domestic and Paris agreements targets. We expect these improvements to be formalised in legislation next year. The improvements include aligning the purpose of the scheme with the Xerocarbon Act and the Paris Agreement, putting a cap on emissions to align with the emissions budgets required in the Xerocarbon Act, enabling the auctioning of units within the scheme, which allows the government to control the quantity of units and therefore the level of emissions in New Zealand, and also the current price of New Zealand units in the scheme, which is around 24.65 New Zealand dollars as of this morning. As Kay mentioned earlier, New Zealand's export-dependent economy has significant reliance on the agriculture sector. 85% of our food production goes to the international market, and we're the world's largest single-country exporter of dairy products and sheep meat. As previously mentioned, almost half of New Zealand's gross greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, with just over 71% of the sector's emissions coming from enteric fermentation in 2017. New Zealand's research programs continue to seek economically viable technologies to reduce these emissions. And so far, we have made significant improvements in production efficiency across the agriculture sector. And while production overall has increased, absolute emissions from agriculture have remained more or less stable since 2005. Our farming sector has taken up the challenge to do more. They have recently agreed to legislation that will be passed in 2020 to price agricultural emissions from 2025 onwards, as well as a joint plan of action to get there and to reduce emissions in the interim. The government is currently working with the sector to find the best pricing mechanism for on-farm emissions, which may be the emissions trading scheme or an alternative tool. New Zealand's energy sector emissions are relatively small compared to other countries, and in part that's because more than 3/4 of New Zealand's electricity is generated using renewable sources, primarily hydro, which has helped energy generation emissions remain low. We have aspirations to reach a goal of 100% renewable energy generation by 2035. We're also investing in green hydrogen and biofuels. In addition, transport offers the potential for significant emissions reductions. It contributed to about 20% of New Zealand's gross emissions in 2017, which makes it the largest source of emissions after agriculture. Transport in New Zealand is dominated by private road transport due to our sparse population and our rural-based economy, We're therefore looking to improve fuel efficiency and to incentivise the uptake of electric vehicles. The government is considering introducing a clean car standard and a clean car discount, which would apply to all new and used light vehicles first registered in New Zealand after 2021. This standard would require vehicle suppliers to lower the average carbon dioxide emissions of the vehicles they're importing to 105 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre, and will be gradually phased in from 2021 to 2025. Forestry plays an important role in meeting our international climate change targets, with forests having offset nearly 30% of New Zealand's gross emissions in 2017. As per the Kyoto Protocol accounting, only offsets from post-1989 forests are counted towards our 2020 target. It is a particularly significant part of the Māori economy, with Māori owning approximately 30% of New Zealand's plantation forests, and this is set to expand further. Accordingly, Māori have significant interests in the emissions trading scheme, which includes, on a mandatory basis, the pre-1990 forest land, and on a voluntary basis, post-1989 forest land. Besides the emissions trading scheme, we have a number of other policies in place to incentivise forest planting, with the most recent being our 1 billion trees program. The goal of this program is to develop the current planting rate, to double the current planting rate to reach 1 billion trees planted across New Zealand by 2028. And currently around 150 million trees are already in the ground. Thank you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. At this point, we're very happy to welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. I would like now to open the floor for questions from the parties. China has a question. China, yes. Switzerland. And then it's Australia. And the guy next to Australia is the European Union. Isn't he? Okay. So who's first? China is first. Okay. China has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks New Zealand for the impressive presentation. We have noted that the gross emission of New Zealand in 2017 has increased by 2% compared with 2016. Could you please share more information on possible additional policies and measures which will lead to further decrease of GHG emissions? And also, as you mentioned, agriculture sector contributes the largest part of GHG emissions in New Zealand. Could you please share some good experience on curbing emissions and building MRV system of agriculture sector? Thank you.
Thank you, China. The European Union has the floor, and the next country is Switzerland.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, New Zealand, for your very interesting presentation. We have one question. New Zealand reports that its government is investing a total planned 333 million New Zealand dollars on constructing cycling infrastructure in main urban centers. Can New Zealand provide some additional information on how it expects this measure to reduce emissions from the transport sector? Thank you.
Thank you, European Union. Switzerland has the floor.
Thank you. Also from our side, thank you very much to New Zealand for the informative presentation. We have noted in its national communication that New Zealand mentions the newly established Climate Commission in the context of future climate policy development. Could New Zealand inform about the composition, the mandate and the tasks of this commission, and about possible first products from its work? Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland. Australia has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, New Zealand, for your presentation today. We just found the slide on your Xerocarbon Act quite interesting. Could you go into any more specific detail on how the Xerocarbon Act will help achieve future targets?
Thank you, Australia. India has the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Like others, we also congratulate New Zealand for an excellent presentation. We read the report with interest. The total GHG emissions without LULUCF of New Zealand have increased by 24.13%. and with LULUCF by 63.63% between 1990 and 2015. So the question from our side is, what are the reasons for the increase in these emissions and what measures New Zealand might take to reducing these emissions, and especially what are the drivers? What drivers are responsible for higher increase with the LULUCF in contrast to many Annex I, non-Annex I, for whom LULUCF increases are lower than without LULUCF. Once again, we congratulate and welcome New Zealand for a very excellent presentation.
Thank you, India. Germany has the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you, New Zealand, for this good and informative presentation. We are interested in your Waste Minimisation Act from 2008. Could New Zealand please provide more information on how this mitigation action will tackle GHG emissions from the waste sector? Is it focused on minimization of disposal of organic waste or on other kinds of waste? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Germany. United States, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to New Zealand for a presentation that contains such rich information. My question is with regards to the Xerocarbon Act, and if you could provide some additional context for the considerations around the separate budget for biogenic methane. Thank you.
Thank you, United States. New Zealand, you have the floor to answer the questions.
Thank you for those questions. I'll start with the questions from China. Thank you for those. Your question was around increases in gross emissions since 2016 and what additional policies will help decrease those emissions. New Zealand's gross emissions have increased since 1990, really on the back of the strong economic and strong population growth. Based on our current data, the WIV measures projections to 2030 show that New Zealand's gross emissions are projected to decrease to 77,239 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. And we have a range of policies in place, some of which I've outlined in my presentation, particularly, I think, noting the Xerocarbon Bill, Xerocarbon Act, setting out the framework to set budgets to reduce emissions over time. And noting that the projections in the report were from the 2017, using 2017 data, which indicate this drop. We're expecting our next report to provide further updated information on that. Your second question was around agriculture, which, as we have discussed, is a significant part of New Zealand's export-dependent economy. The agriculture sector is not currently included in the emissions trading scheme, and the government has introduced the Climate Change Response Emissions Trading Reform Amendment Bill in October this year, which includes pricing agricultural emissions from 2025 onwards. The pricing mechanism for livestock emissions at the farmer level is yet to be determined, but in the period up to 2025, the government and the sector are working together on a joint action plan, which is called He Waka Eke Noa, which is Māori and means we're all in this together. So it gives you a sense of the sector and others working together to make reductions. Progress will be reviewed in 2022. And in the meantime, the government, the sector and Māori will work together to reduce emissions and to build the systems and capability needed for the introduction of a pricing system by 2025. Turning to your question from the European Union on our investment in cycleways, particularly in urban areas, and how this will reduce emissions. The key reason there is by reducing reliance on fossil fuel powered cars. Thank you to our Australian colleagues for your question on how does the Zero Carbon Bill help us meet our future targets. I've provided a little bit of information in the presentation so far. The Zero Carbon Act provides a framework by which New Zealand can develop clear and stable climate change policies that contribute to global effort under the Paris Agreement to limit global average temperature increases to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and allowing New Zealand to prepare for and adapt to the effects of climate change. The Act has 4 key elements within it. First, it establishes an independent climate change commission to provide independent advice and to monitor progress. Second, the 2050 target, as I mentioned, is set in legislation, which gives certainty about how much New Zealand's emissions must reduce. Third, the Act requires a system of emissions budgets and emissions reduction plans that will act as stepping stones towards the target and provides a framework for planning. The fourth component is a set of adaptation measures which will assess and address the risks from a changing climate. These include a national risk assessment and national adaptation plans. Thank you, India, for your question also on what New Zealand can do to reduce its emissions. New Zealand is reforming its emissions trading scheme, as I've mentioned, to encourage further afforestation that will contribute to increased LULUCF removals. We'll continue to account for deforestation emissions in the emission trading scheme. We've also undertaken an ambitious target of planting 1 billion trees over the next 10 years that will help increase LULUCF removals.
Thank you, India. You also asked why it was that we had high emissions from LULUCF. Many of these forests are plantation forests and they are cyclical. So there was extensive planting in the period up to 1990, and many of those forests have come to maturity and will be harvested. And so there is a kind of a sawtooth up and down cycle of forest removals and then forests being harvested. So that explains that figure. Thank you. Good enough.
Thank you. I'll come back to the earlier question from our colleagues in Switzerland for some further detail on the Climate Commission, which is established under the Zero Carbon Act. The Commission will provide independent expert advice to the government. It also monitors and reviews progress towards emissions reductions and adaptation goals. And to give you a little bit more detail on the composition, the Commission will comprise a chair, a deputy chair, and 5 commissioners. The membership of the Commission is based on skills, which are all set out clearly within the Act, which must include a collective understanding of mitigation and adaptation, experience with central and local government, technical skills across economic, social, ecological, and the distributional effects of climate change. Also, the Treaty of Waitangi and Te Ao Māori. The appointments process is run by a nominating committee, which is established by the Minister for Climate Change. The Commission's functions are to provide advice to the Minister on emissions budgets and an emissions reduction plan, to monitor and report on progress towards meeting emissions budgets and the 2050 target, and to prepare the national climate change risk assessments and reports on implementation of national adaptation plans. Thank you. And finally, to pick up the question from Germany, thank you for that, about our Waste Minimisation Act and how this will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Act places a levy on all waste in New Zealand. 50% of the levy goes into the Waste Minimisation Fund, which improves resource efficiency, reuse, recycling to reduce and decrease waste, including organic waste, which was part of your question, to landfill. Also to note that waste is included in New Zealand's emissions trading scheme. Finally, to come to the question from the US about the target within the Xerocarbon Act being split. So it's split into all gases other than biological methane, and then biological methane has a separate target range set out in the Act. So the Act requires that net emissions other than biogenic methane are zero by 2050, and emissions of biogenic methane are 10% less than 2017 levels by 2030, and within the range 24 to 47% less than 2017 levels by 2050. And the reason for this is that it reflects the different nature of the long and short-lived gases. So long-lived, less immediately harmful but persistent and lock in warming, and short-lived gases, very damaging in the short term but leave the atmosphere more quickly. So the Act splits out these two gases to reflect that biogenic methane as a short-lived gas does not need to be reduced to net zero.
And it is also consistent with the IPCC report and consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. And that, I believe, concludes our answers to the questions of parties. Thank you very much.
New Zealand, you have answered the questions. Don't need any more time. You're done. I mean, you have answered. Okay. Thank you very much. I would like now to move on to Luxembourg. I'm pleased to invite Dr. André Weinderhaupt, Director General from the Ministry of Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development, to deliver a brief presentation. Luxembourg, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm still waiting for the slides to be to appear on the screen. But before I start, let me say that Luxembourg very much welcomes this session on multilateral assessment, as it has been stressed already on Saturday, and as it has already been stressed as well by New Zealand and other parties. It offers a unique opportunity to share our own situation with regard to greenhouse gas emissions and related commitments, as well as engaging into a constructive exchange of views with other parties. Now, this does not add up. Luxembourg received 3 questions before end of September and provided comprehensive answers that have all been distributed to parties. Our presentation will be divided in 3 main parts: national circumstances, our greenhouse gas emissions, the development and anticipated emissions up to 2030, and our commitments for 2020 and beyond, and measures put in place to respond to these commitments. Let me first start to show you where Luxembourg is situated. It is a small country located in the northwestern part of Europe. Our neighbors are France, Germany, and Belgium. And besides being a member state of the European Union, Luxembourg is also part from the Benelux, and this reinforces regular cooperation, for instance, as the Talanoa Benelux on climate that happened in 2018, and a platform that has been set up very recently. As you can see on this slide, end of 2018, the population is estimated at 600,000, roughly inhabitants, and the population share of non-national residents in 2018 was as high as 47.8%. In fact, with this slide, I would like to share with you some national circumstances that are very relevant when addressing the development of Luxembourg's greenhouse gas emissions. During the 1970s, with a slowdown of activities in the iron and steel industry, Luxembourg decided to diversify its economy. Nowadays, Luxembourg is a financial hub and has developed an extensive finance industry. As a consequence, Luxembourg attracted and still attracts a lot of people that settle in Luxembourg or that are commuting every day from foreign neighboring countries. 200,000 daily commuters drive every single day to Luxembourg and back home to their resident countries. It is obvious that these developments put pressure on the environment, especially on land use and on consumption, and this element combined with the fact that it is in the middle of the crossroads of Europe, leads to important increases of transport flows and its environmental and social consequences that are related with this. Due to its small size, Luxembourg experiences a disproportionately high impact of single sources of emissions. In fact, Luxembourg is highly depending on energy imports and has a limited potential for renewable energy sources, as the country has no large rivers, no mountains, and not even a coastline, as it is a landlocked country. So only mainly small hydropower stations, wind and solar installations that are also of smaller scale, geothermal energy and biomass and biogas productions. Taking into account future challenges notably derived from the Paris Agreement, Luxembourg committed to a strategic study on possible energy scenarios up to 2030. This is part of Luxembourg's National Energy and Climate Plan to be delivered by the end of this year, as indicated Saturday already by a couple of other EU member states being multilaterally assessed here in Madrid. Now, if we go to Luxembourg's greenhouse gas emissions, you will see these on these slides. Since 1919, greenhouse gas emissions accounted for the commitment periods of the Kyoto Protocol have been reduced by 17%. However, this overall trend hides various developments at sub-levels. Mostly two categories show dramatic changes over the period. They reached their lower level in 1998 when the steel industry switched from basic oxygen furnaces to electric arc furnaces and peaked in 2005, which was related to road fuels. As explained by other EU member states last Saturday, 2005 is the base year for EU commitments, hence also this graph. Emission trading scheme emissions have reduced since 2005, and they are in Luxembourg very small compared to other EU member states, 14% in 2018. Road transportation also decreased since 2005, but this evolution stopped around 2016. Main reason seems to be the international price of petrol and specific negative elasticity demand in Luxembourg. Residential buildings is a rather flat emissions, which is quite remarkable according to the resident population growth. And in economic activities, that is the non-ETS industry and tertiary sector, this is also rather flat emissions, which is quite remarkable also in relation to the tertiary activity growth. May I also show a few trends in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, and I put them in relation to the inhabitants and also in relation to GDP. And you see very clearly from this site that there has been a clear uncoupling between the greenhouse gas emissions and both the inhabitants and also the GDP. So what is our overall commitments? The EU overall commitment by 2020 was -20%, and this is what has been also given as an effort-sharing reduction goal to Luxembourg, and in 2030, at least 40% emission reductions. For renewable energy, we have the commitment by 2030 to be at 32%, and for energy efficiency 32.5%. I have listed the relative and respective EU legislations, but given the time, I will not go into detail in this. Now, if we go to this slide, you see that Luxembourg has raised the level of ambition nationally, and these decisions were taken last week and a week before, so on November 29th and on December 6th, Luxembourg's government has decided to go for a 55% reduction in non-ETS greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 with respect to 2005, to consider scientific calls, notably the IPCC special report on the 1.5 degrees. The instruments to do so is the already mentioned National Energy and Climate Plan and a new climate framework law, which will be our main future overarching policy and measures. In this slide, you see the historic trends and also the forecasted and committed emission reductions. The blue line on the upper left is the effort sharing decision emissions. The gray line that you see crossing the green line is the adjusted annual emission allocation for Luxembourg starting year 2013. And then you see on the two lines to the very right what it means when Luxembourg commits to reduce the emission reductions to 55%. That is the brown line. How are the emissions being split over the sectors? So you see that 64.4% of the emissions are in the road transport sector, and that residents is 19.9% of these 60.4%, and non-residents the remaining 44.5%. So that is fuel export. Agriculture is only a very small share of it, and the construction sector is basically 13%, as well as the remaining part of the industry. I have cut off the emission trading scheme. I already mentioned the climate law, which is the objectives of the climate law. It is 55% reduction in greenhouse gases, as already said, by 2013 with reference to 2005. It's a progressive and binding climate objectives for 5 sectors, zero net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and also principles such as environmental and social equity and climate justice. In governance, 3 bodies have been set up: an interministerial coordination committee, a climate action platform with civil society, and the climate observatory with science. Nationally, energy and climate plan find their legal base in the Climate Act. There's a Climate and Energy Fund that provides funding, and the MOV and monitoring has also its findings in and its legal bindings in this Act. We have the NACP that I already have stated, that is the National Energy and Climate Plans. There are 5 domains. Most of them are mainly related to energy, but decarbonization, including renewable energies and energy efficiency, obviously is very much linked to greenhouse gas emissions. I don't go into the detail, as the slides will be shared with all of you over internet. May I now pick several more prominent measures that we have set up. First, a measure in residential buildings. Luxembourg has decided a nearly zero energy standard for new residential buildings and a financial support for increasing energy efficiency standards in existing buildings and promoting the use of renewable energy sources also in buildings. Then to have all 102 municipalities on board, we have set up a climate agreement with the municipalities. This is founded by a legal act, and the joining in is voluntary, but yet you are in, you need to follow some mandatory obligations. We succeeded that all 102 municipalities joined in on a voluntary basis, and the darkness of the green color indicates how far the individual municipalities are promoting their climate policy at a local scale. There's a certification level in that according to the European Energy Award Scheme, but we also have a monitoring in that and so on. In the sake of time, I move quickly to the next one. We have with the industry set up a voluntary agreement with the industrial sector when it comes to energy efficiency. The majority of the country's large industrial energy consumers participate in this voluntary agreement, and that is about 60 enterprises. Remember, Luxembourg is a small country. The general objective of 7% increase in energy efficiency for the 2017 and 2020 agreement, so that's not the first one because we started already back in 1996, will be evaluated on the basis of the average energy efficiency levels recorded for 2014 and 2015. Last not least, I come to the elephant in the room, that is how to tackle the transport sector. Basically, Luxembourg introduced carbon fuel taxes, the so-called Kyoto cent, which is at this stage as high as, or as low as you may look at the figures, of 2.5 euro cent per liter of gasoline and 3.5 euro cent per liter of diesel. Last Friday, December 6th, the government in council decided, in addition, to introduce a carbon-related a carbon tax, which is not on this slide, and then also a carbon-related passenger tax, which is basically 40% of the carbon of the passengers' car tax, which also goes into the Climate and Energy Fund. The Climate and Energy Fund is then used for the purpose of Luxembourg's commitments in international climate finance, but also in addition, obviously, also to finance national mitigation measures. In the transport sector, we have also set up a policy which is called MODU, Mobilité Durable, Sustainable Mobility, which also comes in with a very high share of public transport. It's an aim to change the modal split very significantly as compared to its current status. And then in my last slide, I also wanted to come with other measures that we have set up in mobility. Luxembourg provides direct subsidies for zero low emission cars and for e-bikes. There's fiscal benefits in kind for leased cars that are now based on CO2 emissions per kilometer and propulsion means. There's a deployment of e-mobility through the required infrastructure, 1,600 charging stations being put all over the country, and as of 1st of March 2020, public transport will be free all over Luxembourg. Having this said, I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention and apologize if I may have been a little bit too long.
Thank you, Luxembourg. I now open the floor for questions from the parties. India has the floor.
Thank you, Chair. India warmly welcomes the presentation by Luxembourg and also congratulates it for an excellent presentation. We note that the SF6 emissions have reportedly increased by 914%, 914%, between 1990 to 2015. According to IPCC, if we recollect, SF6 is the most potent GHG that has been evaluated with a global warming potential of 23,900 times that of CO2 when compared over a 100-year period. In this backdrop, or with this backdrop, our question is, what are the reasons for the increase in these emissions and what measures Luxembourg might take to reduce these emissions? Thank you, Chair, and congratulations to Luxembourg once again for a very nice and lucid presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, India. Switzerland has the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you to Luxembourg. I think it's always impressive to see what small countries can present in these contexts. We sometimes think ourselves we are a small country, but I think Luxembourg shows that even smaller ones can do quite a lot. In its 7th national communication, Luxembourg makes reference to an interministerial working group looking at possible avenues to reduce the importance of road fuel sales for emissions in the transport sector, the elephant that has been mentioned already. At the same time, the working group is tasked with developing proposals to make public finances less dependent from that source of income. Now, you have mentioned in your presentation a recent decision regarding transport-related policies. Perhaps if you could elaborate a bit more on what exactly is the content of that decision, if there are specific policies that or targets that have been decided on. And we would also like to know if the working group I have mentioned before has identified options to influence transport emissions or to use the revenue from road fuel sales to assist the country in the transition to a more sustainable economic model. Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland. The next country is Liechtenstein.
Thank you, and thank you for the floor. I compliment Luxembourg on the mitigation achievements so far, and thank you for the very good presentation. I have just 2 small questions. For your new 2030 goal of -55%, do you plan to reduce those emissions domestically, or do you intend to make use of the market mechanisms of Article 6? And the second question, what are your ideas or visions to reach zero net GHG emissions by 2050? Thank you.
Thank you, Liechtenstein. Luxembourg, you have the floor for the answers. Oh, sorry. There's one more intervention by China.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Luxembourg, for your informative presentation. It is impressive that Luxembourg will adopt such effective measures on transportation. And we have a small question. I'm curious that did you meet any challenges in calculate the emissions from civil aviation sector and waterborne navigation? Thank you.
Thank you, China. Since there's nobody else asking the floor, Luxembourg, you have the floor for the questions, for the answers.
Thank you very much. Okay. So thank you very much for your questions. I will reply to the question from the distinguished delegate from India regarding the F-gases. First of all, I would like to stress the fact that F-gases in Luxembourg in 2017 represented around 1% of our total emission, excluding LULUCF. Of course, we got an increase in these F-gas emissions, as you have noticed. This is due, of course, of the economic development in the country, but also linked to the cars and the traffic in the country. So we're not really having specific measures to deal with F-gases, and as it was said by most of the member states of the EU on Saturday, the main policy driver for F-gas is this F-gas regulation at EU level that Luxembourg is going to be and is applying actually in its policies. So we are following these recommendations and these obligations from this EU regulation with regard to F-gases. Concerning the projections of F-gases that we have recently produced, they are rather flat. The reason is that they are quite conservative. The reason is that on one side, we know that with the technological development, the F-gas emission links to the cars will be diminishing. But at the same time, with the increase of population in Luxembourg and the fact that we will have more hot summer, there will be also more installations of climatization installation in the country that might, on the other side, increase these emissions. So that's for the reason, we don't have precise calculation on that, but we believe that the emissions won't really reduce in the coming years. That's not a sector we will focus on. The sector we will really focusing on is transport, energy efficiency in the buildings, agriculture, but I will give the floor to André for the other questions and the reply. Thank you.
Yes, to the other questions, first, thank you, Switzerland, for the sympathy among small countries. That's very much appreciated. And we got even a question by one of the other smaller countries. I will get into that in 1 minute. Switzerland, you referred to, as we have listed in our national communication, to the Comité Interministériel, which is dealing about the evolution of the greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector. The Comité Interministériel has two levels, a civil servant level and a ministerial level, and it's the ministers for economy, the minister of finance, who has lead, a minister for environment, climate change and sustainable development, as well as the minister for energy, that are sitting in this interministerial committee. The committee basically analyzes the evolutions of the fuel sales and then decides to take measures or not to take measures. The first measure has been taken earlier this year, 1st of May, when a fuel tax rise was decided. The committee, after that, had also its meeting in fall, and there was a decision that was taken, but which has not yet been published. So I cannot share it because otherwise I can share this bilaterally, but we have weak clue on this at this stage. So basically this committee decides upon this. The raises of fuel taxation is, let's say, the revenues of it is half-half, put into the normal national budget, and the other half is put into the Fonds Climat et Énergie, the Climate and Energy Fund that I have listed already. And to give you an answer to your question, this allows a sufficient budget for the Climate and Energy Fund also to finance the mitigation measures in the transport sector. In addition, half of the national expenditures for all infrastructure expenditures made by the state, so also public buildings, etc., half of it have been allocated to public transport during the last 5 years. So basically there's an ongoing investment strategy that assures that that the change will take place in the in the transport sector. I hope this answers your questions. Going to Liechtenstein, Liechtenstein's question came with the exact measures that we would use to reduce the greenhouse gases by 55%, and a question whether we would make profit of market mechanisms in this respect. Luxembourg will not take, as all European member states, market mechanisms outside of the EU. Will not make use of market mechanisms outside the EU to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, whereas internally among EU member states we can obviously also try to find other EU member states that would have emission reductions that were significantly higher as those that have been allocated to them by the effort sharing regulation, and then we could find a deal between two EU member states. And in addition, also the regulation that I referred to gives also some flexibility for member states, but they are only at a level of 4%, so that is not very significant. Liechtenstein also asked a question about the policies and measures that would allow us the zero net emissions by 2050, which is a very good question, and we as a EU member state are in the lead in this respect within the long-term strategy that has been drafted by the European Commission, and I could share this documentation to all parties if interest be, because this long-term strategy of the European Union shows the pathway on how to go towards the zero net emissions by 2050. In addition to that, I may also refer to Wednesday's publication by the Vice President of the European Commission, or the disclosure of the so-called Green Deal, which also will come with these measures. And then last, the questions that have been asked by China, they refer to the civil aviation sector and to navigation. Luxembourg is, as an EU member state, in the internal ETS aviation regulation. So basically for emissions by civil aviation that are exclusively internal EU displacements, there's an emission trading scheme that is already in place. And obviously, as of 2023, we will move to the CORSIA system, which has been foreseen to be operational within ICAO. When it comes to navigation, similarly, we are amongst the committed EU member states that push a lot for a similar system being set up in navigation, and obviously this will be under the lead of the IMO, and we are also very keen on transposing what will be set up at IMO level as soon as these decisions will be taken. I hope, Chair, that this has answered all questions that have been raised by the delegations, and I thank you very much once more for your attention.
Thank you, Luxembourg, for your answers. I would like to now move on to Portugal. I would like to invite Eduardo Ferreira Santos, Head of the Department for Climate Change from the Portuguese Environment Agency, to deliver a brief presentation. Portugal, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues. As others, I would like to first state that we see this multilateral assessment process as a good opportunity to share our progress and in delivering our commitments, exchange views in a frank and honest way. We believe this process shows the strong benefits of transparency and of a robust MRV system. I would like also to thank at this moment all those parties that sent us questions in the process, and the Secretariat and the review teams for their work throughout the process. So in terms of Portugal's commitment by 2020, as other EU member states, we are working alongside with the EU and the other member states towards the pledge under the Convention on an unconditional quantified economy-wide emission reduction target of 20% by 2020 compared to 1990 levels. This also translates in a binding commitment under the Kyoto Protocol, implementing the CP2 commitment since the first day of January 2013. And this translates into, as you have seen with other colleagues from EU member states, into a breakdown of emissions regarding the emissions trading scheme and the sectors that are therein, and on non-ETS, the so-called effort sharing, which for Portugal translates to the possibility of increasing its emissions by 1% compared to 2005 levels by 2020. LULUCF is accounted by using the CP2 rules, obviously. In terms of the 2030 commitments, and I'll bring this up in this slide also, but come back later to this. The NDC that was communicated under the Paris Agreement amounts to the commitment by the EU and its member states to a binding target of at least minus 40% of domestic reductions in GHG emissions by 2030. This translates our current emissions from 1990 to 2018, being that the figures for 2018 are still estimates of a proxy that we every year calculate. So it's not data from the inventory that is submitted to the UNFCCC, but still it is a proxy that we estimate on a yearly basis. You will see that in the latest years there are a couple of spikes there in 2015 and 2017. Which relate strongly or correlate strongly to drought years in Portugal. We have a very strong basis of hydropower production, and the market condition, the electricity market conditions in those years also benefited the production of coal versus natural gas. So our emissions spiked in those years, as you no doubt notice, due to the accumulated effect of these two impacts. You will also see that in 2017, the green line goes beyond the blue line, which is, the blue line is emissions without LULUCF, and the green line emissions with LULUCF. So this means that in 2017, due to intense forest fires with severe consequences, including in the loss of life in Portugal, our emissions, the sector was a net emitter in that year, which only, and with relation to climate policy, only stresses the relevance of emission reduction and increasing the resilience of forests and reducing the vulnerability in that regard. Moving on to another breakdown of the picture of the compliance with 2020 targets, you will see in light blue what the +1 trajectory that I mentioned in the effort sharing, under the effort sharing represents, and in darker blue you will see our emissions in the sectors not covered by the ETS. And you will see with this that we have in every single year since 2013 been below what the target for every year indicates. So we are over complying with the effort sharing regulation in this respect. And we expect that the same trend will maintain in 2019 and 20. The breakdown of Portugal's commitments towards 2030. In the first column, you will have the EU 2030 targets that you will recognize from the multiple presentations from other EU colleagues throughout this process. The second column is the translation of 2030 commitments that Portugal has put forward, and being that the 17% that is shown last in that column relating to GHG emission reduction in the non-ETS sectors relates to, again, the new iteration of the effort sharing regulation. But we have at the national level increased or undertook an economy-wide target of emission reductions of 45 to 55% by 2030, and this in the context of the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 that Portugal undertook in 2016, and we have worked on the trajectories for what this implies, and the 45 to 55% comes directly from that work on the carbon neutrality by 2050. This picture shows exactly that, the trajectory that we are at the moment committing to up to 2050, that will allow us to achieve and deliver carbon neutrality by 2050. It has implications for both 2040 and 2030. As I mentioned, the -45 to -55 in 2030 already comes from this trajectory, and it comes also from one of the guiding principles of our decarbonization or our low carbon roadmap, which is the next decade is a crucial decade in terms of emission reduction and in terms of delivering the policies and the trajectory that puts us on track to a net zero goal by 2050. The carbon neutrality roadmap was adopted by the Council of Ministers in July this year, and it was then submitted in September in the UN General Assembly promoted by the UN Secretary General in New York. It was then submitted as Portugal's long-term strategy under the Paris Agreement. You will see in the table also what the trajectory implies in terms of emission reductions. By 2040, we are committing to a reduction of 65 to 75%, and the translation of carbon neutrality by 2050 amounts to an 85 to 90% reduction by 2050. Main drivers that we are considering in terms of action for this period of over the next 30 years, but with very, very high implications already by 2030 in the context of, again, as you've heard from other EU colleagues, in the context of our national energy and climate plan. We are undertaking policies across the board in all sectors. I would just highlight a couple of policies at the moment in terms of phasing out coal-based power generation. Our two remaining power plants, one by 2021 and the other by 2023. The energy transition in the transport sector, we see a great potential for a radical change in the sector, both in terms of public transport, but also in terms of the technologies. So the electric mobility and new modes of transport, of mobility are essential here in this regard. I would, at this moment, I would, more than going through this slide, I would ask for colleagues in the Secretariat to show a video of our roadmap. Okay. Okay, I would now thank you very much for your attention and leave you with a picture of what it means to be carbon neutral for Portugal by 2050 and the trajectory and what actions we will promote and undertake in the next 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Portugal. The floor is open for questions from the parties. China too. And then it's Australia. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Portugal, for the presentation and for the video. I enjoyed that very much. We just had one question. We see that Portugal has implemented a number of measures to address transport emissions. If possible, could you please indicate which of these measures has been the most effective in reducing transport emissions to date? Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. India has the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We congratulate the distinguished delegate from Portugal for an informative presentation and the excellent video that you just showed on how would be life in 2050 in Portugal. From your third BR, we note that the total greenhouse gas emissions without LULUCF has increased of the order of 15.72% between 1990 and 2015. With this backdrop, the question is, what are the reasons of this increase and how, what are the measures, specific measures that Portugal is taking to reduce these emissions, and what implications does this have on the European Union to achieve the overall targets in emission reduction, both pre-2020 and beyond? Thank you.
Thank you, India. China has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Portugal, for your clear presentation. From the figure that you have just showed us, both emissions with and without LULUCF sector have decreased since 2016. We have noted that the emissions with LULUCF sector decreased greater than the emissions without LULUCF. Could you please give us more information about it? And did you update the data resources of LULUCF? Thank you.
Thank you, China. Australia has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Portugal, for that great presentation. We just have a clarifying question about something that was in your third biennial report. In the report, it stated that because of Portugal's vulnerability to climate change impacts, the government have developed a website to provide information on Portugal's future climate. We were just wondering what were the key risks covered on the website and what measures has Portugal got in place to address them? Thank you.
Thank you, Australia. The United States.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Portugal for this presentation. The video was particularly helpful. If you can't visualize the future clearly, it's tough to get there, and that was very clear. Regarding the two LULUCF emission spikes, or in terms of change in stocks, you noted that it was related to droughts. Has there been any consideration of measures that might address both carbon stocks and adaptation concerns related to these droughts?
Thank you, United States. Since there's no other party, Portugal, you have the floor for the answers to the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for all the questions. With regards to New Zealand's question on transport and the measures, I would stress the deployment of charging infrastructures for electric mobility that was started back in 2009-10. And we have seen again in the latest years a resurgence of sales in electric vehicles. Additionally, we have promoted the acquisition of vehicles of high environmental performance, namely of low carbon by individuals and companies, in particular hybrids and electrics. Through both, there is also a positive discrimination on motor vehicles taxes that also contributes to this. So the CO2 component on a registration tax and the CO2 component on an annual circulation tax. In addition, and most recent policy that was undertook and that took effect this year is a public transport tariff reduction support program that allowed for a 35% increase in sales of transport tickets and a 12% increase in passengers in public transport in major cities of the country. With regards to India's question on the increase on emissions since 1990, Portugal has undertook since that period quite a significant development growth of its economy, and you see also a relation with that to our emissions up to 2005. What we see from 2005 onwards is a decoupling of our emission, or a trend of decoupling that we still continue to see of our emissions compared to economic growth. So that is basically the reason. The first 15 years up to from 1990, there was a very strong economic development in the country with implications on the emissions and decoupling since then. As regards the implications for EU targets under both for 2020 and 2030, as was shown, we are in compliance with the 2020 targets, and our estimates is that we will also be in compliance with our current 2030 targets. So there will be no implications in that regard. With regards to Australia's question, I understood it relates to vulnerabilities, a website related to vulnerabilities and linking it to adaptation. Is that the case? Just a clarification of the question so I can address it.
Yes, so it was in your third biennial report that you talked about the website available on vulnerabilities to climate change, and we just wanted to know on this website what are the key risks that are conveyed.
Okay, that is clear. We have at the moment that portal is online. We call it Portal do Clima. It basically conveys information on the evolution of, or the prospects of climate scenarios for the future in Portugal under two emission scenarios of the IPCC, the 4.5 and the 8.5. And what we see as main vulnerabilities of the country relate to droughts, forest fires, rapid flooding in cities, heat waves in cities again. So quite significant impacts that are expected or are foreseen under the more extreme scenarios. We will, or we are currently working in a project that we will call, at least at the moment we are calling it the Roadmap for Adaptation, which will update the basis of information and continue to derive information relevant for the public. That is also one of our objectives regarding the vulnerabilities of the countries and the costs of both action and inaction on adaptation. With regards to the question on the US on carbon stocks and adaptation, I think that part of part of the reply relates to what I just said on adaptation. In addition to that, I would just add that we have started a program on ecosystem services and remuneration, aiming to provide rural territories with greater competitiveness and ensuring a model of greater environmental sustainability. So in this regard, we would also see this as a measure for increasing resilience of territories and so addressing in particular forest fire vulnerabilities. I think this, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot, I forgot China. My apologies. The increase in emissions from 2016, I'm not exactly sure. I would again ask for a clarification if you could further specify what you are referring in terms of the LULUCF. The emissions trend with and without LULUCF. My apologies, but could you please clarify again the question?
Yeah, we are asking that the emissions without LULUCF sector decreased less than with LULUCF sector. So we want to know about the changements of LULUCF during 2016. Thank you.
Okay, now it's clear. Thank you. I will have to defer that question for later, actually, because I'm not quite sure what the reason for that trend is. If we could pick this specific question offline afterwards, that would be very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Portugal. We now move to the last presentation, which is by Switzerland. I would like to invite His Excellency Franz Perez from the Federal Department of the Environment, Transport, Energy and Communications to deliver a brief presentation. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and dear colleagues. It is my pleasure to be back in this important setting of mutual exchange. We appreciate the opportunity for explaining the circumstances that are guiding our policy approach, for reporting on success stories, but also to mention some challenges we face in contributing to the achievement of the goals of the Climate Change Convention. While my presentation is based on Switzerland's 7th National Communication and the 3rd Biennial Report, we have updated some information beyond the submission state of these reports to indicate the present state of play. In addition, we would like to give you some background information about the ongoing policy making process with regard to the more ambitious targets foreseen for the future. Let me move to the first slide. I would like to give you an update on a few key parameters characterizing the situation of Switzerland. The growth of many socioeconomic indicators that act as important drivers for greenhouse gas emissions has continued in recent years. While population, GDP, industrial production, and the heated air in buildings expanded strongly, greenhouse gas emissions saw a considerable drop of more than 12% in the period since 1990. Compared to numbers presented for 2014 at our previous multilateral assessment in Marrakesh, the decrease amounts to another minus 30 percentage points. This slide illustrates a bit more details in the development of population versus greenhouse gas emissions. While the population growth in Switzerland accelerated over the period 1990 to 2017, the total greenhouse gas emissions fluctuated around the 1990 level until around 2010, when emissions started to decrease. As a result, per capita emissions fell in Switzerland significantly over time. Today, Switzerland's per capita emissions are more than 30% lower than in 1990. The decoupling between GDP growth and greenhouse gas emissions is even larger. However, when aiming at a low or even a net zero emission society, the relative decoupling of emissions from economic growth is not sufficient. While the low-hanging fruit potential are exhausted to some extent, the harder task of structural change to technologies and consumption patterns compatible with a stable climate still lay ahead of us. With this slide, I would like to illustrate the sectoral pattern of the emissions in Switzerland. The transport and the building sector are together taken account for almost 60% of total emissions. This explains why there is a clear focus in reduction of fossil transport and heating fuels in Swiss climate policy. Emissions from energy production, which form part of the industry sectors, are rather low due to the large share of electricity generated based on hydropower and nuclear energy. In future, the share of renewable energy needs to be increased further in line with the provisions of the National Energy Strategy 2050 in order to compensate for the planned shutdown of the individual nuclear power plants. Smaller reduction potential exists in agriculture and in the waste sector. Emissions from agriculture are closely linked to the number of livestock and to the use of fertilizer. The waste emissions shown in the slide include the increasing emissions from the incineration of waste for the production of electricity, district heating and process heat. These are in part counterbalanced by the decreasing emissions from solid waste deposit. The next slide highlights the core measures currently in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Switzerland. These are implemented under the CO2 Act of 2011, which is the overarching legal framework for Switzerland's present climate policy. The measures include the CO2 levy on heating and fossil fuels, the domestic emissions trading schemes directed at large CO2 emitting companies, the national building refurbishment program, CO2 emissions regulation for new passenger cars, as well as standards for the continuous reduction of CO2 emissions in new and existing buildings, the partial domestic compensation of CO2 emissions from transport fuel use, a technology fund supporting climate-friendly innovations in industry, and agreements to regulate emissions from municipal waste incineration plants and large electricity substations. To date, agriculture and forestry are not regulated in the context of the CO2 Act. Various measures contributing to diminish greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture sector in lockstep with a reduction of air pollution. Work is ongoing to include a specific sectoral target for agriculture with a revision of the CO2 Act and to define corresponding measures for implementations in the agriculture sector. The climate-related goal of forest policy is to adapt forests by increasing resilience to climate change and take into account the high growing stock to reduce CO2 emissions by substituting other material or fossil fuels rather than enhancing sink capacity. Thus, the primary contribution of policies and measures in the forestry sector lies in the sustainable use of wood as a CO2-neutral building material and energy source. With the next slide, I would like to illustrate Swiss climate policy by one of our most successful measures, the CO2 levy on heating and process fuels. By increasing the price of fossil heating and process fuels, the CO2 levy sets an incentive to use fossil fuels more efficiently, to invest in low-carbon technology, and to switch to low-carbon and carbon-free energy sources. In recent years, in line with the legal provisions and based on the regular evaluations, the rate of the levy has been raised in several steps from the initial rate of 12 Swiss francs per ton of CO2 in 2008 to 69 Swiss francs per ton of CO2, which corresponds to about $96 per ton of CO2. As a basic principle, Proceeds from the CO2 levy are refunded to the Swiss population on a per capita basis and to the Swiss economy in proportion to the wages paid. Following a parliamentary decision in June 2009, up to 1/3 of the revenue for the CO2 levy is earmarked to finance the National Building Refurbishments Programme. Additionally, a smaller share of the levy revenues is invested into a fund to promote innovative technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the consumption of resources, support the use of renewable energy, and increase energy efficiency. For the third CO2 Act, which is presently undergoing consultation in Parliament, the Swiss government proposes to increase the maximum rate of the levy to 210 Swiss francs, equivalent to approximately 210 US dollars per ton of CO2. As under current legislation, the levy shall be increased stepwise depending on the evaluation of greenhouse gas emissions from heating fuels. Let me briefly highlight another important measure which is targeting the transport sector. Based on the current CO2 Act, as for 2014, fossil fuel importers are bound to offset part of the CO2 emissions from the motor fuel use through investments in domestic emission reduction projects. The offset is financed by surcharges on fossil transport fuels, which shall not exceed 5 cents per litre of fuels. The Swiss government determined the share of CO2 emissions from motor fuels to be offset by fuel importers to be increased stepwise, as indicated in the slide. The revenue and climate change abatement measures are managed by a private foundation for climate protection and carbon offsets under the supervision of the federal administration. By the end of 2018, the foundation was budgeting for the compensation of a cumulative total of 6.3 million tons of CO2 equivalents for the years from 2013 to 2020. The compensation is to be achieved by national projects and programs, as well as by the purchase of eligible domestic carbon credits, for example, through credits from companies that have exceeded their agreed individual reduction targets. It is planned to continue and strengthen the partial compensation of CO2 emissions from motor fuels use in the framework of the third CO2 Act. While consultations in Parliament are still going on, the initial proposal of the Swiss government contains the following cornerstones. The share of the CO2 emissions from motor fuels to be offset by fuels importers is fixed at the maximum of 90%, and the share of emissions to be compensated domestically is fixed at the minimum of 15%. The next slides presents the greenhouse gas projection that Switzerland has provided in the 17th national communication, complemented by Switzerland's assigned amount from 2013 to 2020. The development of emissions in recent years indicates that it may be difficult to achieve the target Switzerland has committed to under the second commitment period on the KP by the policies and measures presently in place alone. As a matter of fact, the reality of the source of the Swiss emissions and the current legislation provides limited room for short-term adjustment measures. However, the use of contributions from market-based mechanisms, as recognized under the Kyoto Protocol and in line with the strict quality criteria in our law, forms part of Switzerland's approach to achieve its target on the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. These credits will be financed by the funds that we raised by the climate change foundations during the first commitment period of the Kyoto period. They will be accounted for at the end of the commitment period. Thus, we are confident that we will be able to honour our commitment by 2020, as we did at the end of the first commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. As regards the future development of emissions, let me now conclude with a medium to long-term outlook on targets and policies envisaged by the government for the time beyond 2020. These slides depicts the evolution of emissions reduction targets in Switzerland. On the first commitment period of the KP, Switzerland had a target of -8% for the period 2008 to 2012. In accordance with the rules of the Kyoto Protocol, in October 2015, Switzerland retired the units corresponding to its reported and verified emissions for this period, thus fulfilling its commitment under the Kyoto Protocol. At present, Switzerland is committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 15.8% in average compared to the 1990 level during the second commitment period of the KPITS 2013 to 2020. This target is consistent with Switzerland's quantified economy-wide emission reduction target of -20% below the emissions of the year 1990 by 2020. As indicated before, and similarly to the first commitment period, the target for the period 2013 to 2020 foresees that carbon credits from international mechanisms will partly be used. Looking in the future, by submitting its first NDC in 2015, Switzerland committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 compared to 1990 level, corresponding to an average reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 35% over the period. Finally, in late August of this year, the Swiss government expressed its intention to reduce the Swiss greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. The competent ministry is currently working on a long-term climate strategy that will show how Switzerland can achieve this goal. The outcome will serve as a basis for a future revision of the CO2 Act, where targets, policies and measures for the time horizon beyond 2030 will be defined. Switzerland intends to communicate its indicative long-term target to the Climate Convention in 2020 by adjusting its nationally determined contributions, thus further raising its ambition. At the same time, our upcoming NDC will be updated using the mitigation guidance adopted at COP24 in the Katowice last year. Finally, let me briefly turn to the ongoing revision of our CO2 Act. With its draft to Parliament, the Swiss government proposed a target of 50% reduction compared to the 1990 level by 2030 and expressed its intention to build upon the measures that have proven their effectiveness in the past. Several important decisions need to be taken by Parliament, such as what share of the target shall be achieved through domestic measures, to what extent the CO2 levy shall be raised during the decades to come, and how the revenue of the levy, to the extent it is not redistributed to the population and business, shall be spent for the promotion of measures to reduce emissions. At the same time, new ideas that recently came up on the political debate show as more ambitious requirements for the transport and building sectors, as well as the introduction of an airplane ticket levy, will form part of the imminent deliberations of Parliament. We expect the Parliament process to conclude in course of 2020 and to revise the CO2 Act to enter into force the year after. This will set us on track for the -50 target and further reductions towards the objective of a Paris Agreement. This concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention, and we look now forward to any questions that might come from the floor.
Thank you, Switzerland. The floor is now open for the parties. The European Union has the floor.
Thank you, Switzerland, for this excellent presentation and the very detailed answers that we have received to our written questions. So this is just a small follow-up question. There are agreements between the Climate Change Foundation and the Swiss Confederation to provide the required amount of carbon credits by the end of the second commitment period. Could Switzerland provide more details about the nature of their agreement with the Climate Change Foundation and the likelihood that these will be able to be used to meet their 2020 target? Thank you.
Thank you, European Union. Switzerland has the floor. The Republic of Korea has the floor for the question.
Thank you, Switzerland, for a very comprehensive presentation. So in your presentation, you have mentioned several measures that first need to be considered and decided by the Swiss Parliament before the ongoing third revision of the CO2 Act will be concluded. So what is the procedure foreseen for the law to be able to enter into force? Thank you.
Thank you, Republic of Korea. The next party is Austria.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Switzerland, for your excellent presentation. We have a follow-up question to you, written question on the revision to the projections posed by the EU. In the answer, Switzerland noted that if the target for 2020 is not met, then emissions will have to be reduced more quickly in subsequent years. What are your plans to step up to meet these possibly needed larger emission reductions? Thank you.
Thank you, Austria. Belgium has the floor for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Switzerland, for your excellent presentation. We have a question about the institutional arrangements with regard to the organization of climate policy in Switzerland. As Belgium, Switzerland has a federal system. It's indicated in your third biennial report that Switzerland has established several bodies. There is an interdepartmental sustainable development committee, which defines priorities for action, oversees implementation and monitoring of progress. And also there is an interdepartmental committee on climate of the federal authorities, which is responsible for the coordination between different policy areas and make sure that there is a coherent climate policy of the Swiss Confederation. So my question is, would you elaborate a little bit on how these bodies are involved in the coordination of policies and measures implemented at federal, canton level or local levels? And in particular, what is the process in place for preparing your NDC and for defining your local strategy in this context? Thank you.
Thank you, Belgium. New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Switzerland for that very comprehensive presentation. In fact, it was so comprehensive that you have actually just answered a question I was going to ask you about how you are planning to meet your 2020 targets. So that just leaves me with one question. Eliminating fossil fuel subsidies is important in terms of making finance flows consistent with low greenhouse gas emissions. So could Switzerland please outline any reforms to fossil fuel subsidies that have been undertaken? Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. India has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and we commend Switzerland for an excellent presentation. We studied your table 1S2, and we note that total GHG emissions of Switzerland are declining and in negative. So, for example, without LULUCF, the percentage of change is minus 9.97%, and with LULUCF, it is minus 11.18% between 1990 and 2015. So, this is a very encouraging thing for we as developing countries to note. So we were just thinking aloud that what could be the measures that you have taken. You have elaborated some measures which you have taken for limiting these emission increase. But I was interested in knowing how does it impact your, not how, but does it impact your economic growth and the issue of just transition? If you would like to educate me on these. These are just out of my curiosity. If you don't wish to answer even then, also it is all right because these are largely comments, not questions. And I once again compliment you. But before I leave this floor, I wanted to ask the chair. There are certain general questions relating to this kind of data which is generated by BRs and BURs. Is this the right time, or do you give the floor after countries have finished, as we have been doing in the past in such multilateral assessment?
India, the floor will be given after.
Thank you, sir. So my question would be then.
Thank you, India. Brazil has the floor, and the next country is China. Brazil.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Switzerland, for the great presentation. Is there any government plan to stimulate biofuel use in the medium term?
Thank you, Brazil. China?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Switzerland, for your clear presentation. We want to ask if you have some good experience to share in increasing public awareness in addressing climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, China. Switzerland, you have the floor to answer the questions.
Thank you. It's really good. Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the questions which show an interest in our efforts to contribute to the common objective outlined in the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement. Let me try to address them step by step, and if I miss a question, please come back. I'm sorry for that. First, the question of the EU. What was it? Oh, yes. The question of the EU was what the climate change policy, to explain that further. So the arrangement is that the Climate Change Foundation has to hand in the amount that is needed to compensate for the emissions from the traffic as it was decided by the government and by legislation. And that will be one part. They will achieve that very well. In addition to that, we have now entered, because there is more money available than is needed in order to meet our targets under the Kyoto period. So in addition now, we have entered in a second arrangement with the Climate Change Foundation, allowing the use of that money also in order to pilot cooperation under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. It is a foundation, so the money can only be used for the purposes of the foundation. It cannot be used for something else. Therefore, also these amounts that will not be used for meeting the Kyoto targets will flow into contributing emission reductions, which is finally the objective of the whole exercise. Then moving to the question of Korea, we were expecting that the Swiss policy process might raise some questions because it is special. So we have even prepared a slide to that, and I'm glad that Korea was addressing that issue so we can use it. The Swiss policy-making process is complex. So normally it begins with the government making a proposal and then launching formal consultations. After that, the government submits a finalized draft to Parliament. After all sectors and stakeholders have been consulted, the draft is going to the Parliament. In Parliament, we have two chambers, and each of the chamber is examining it first in a committee, and then it's sent to the plenary, and then afterwards it's sent to the second chamber. So 1 year ago, during the Katowice COP, it was discussed in the first chamber, and the final proposal, so the first chamber worked on that proposal from government, changed it, it has weakened it a little bit or a lot, and at the end it was rejected by the whole first chamber. So it is now the second chamber that is now looking was then afterwards looking again at the initial proposal from government, because there was no agreement in the first chamber. The second chamber, the Council of State, had its examination, consultations in the committee and in Parliament, and it has adopted now an amended draft in last autumn. This is a draft that is even a little bit stronger than the proposals from the government. It is now sent back to the first chamber, to the National Council, which is now engaging. Currently, it is in the committee of that chamber, and will go back to the plenary for adoption, hopefully next spring. And then, if there are any remaining differences between the legislation adopted by the two chambers, then they would have to sort it out. Afterwards, after having been adopted by both chambers, the referendum period begins in Switzerland. So there is, during a 3-month period, if 50% of the voters request a referendum, then we would have a public vote on the legislation, and if that passes, then it would enter into force. So it is a complex and a procedure, but I think this procedure also shows and is an answer to one of the questions that was raised in ECHO this morning towards all parties, to show how the decision-making process is taking place. This procedure shows there is ample space for public consultations, first in the phase when the government is preparing a proposal towards legislation, towards the parliament, and then of course also the parliament itself, the committees of the parliament, reaches again out to stakeholders to get their input. So I think we have not only answered your question, but also the question that was raised by ECHO this morning. Then the question of Austria, I think that is a really interesting question, because indeed we agree with that conclusion. If we are not able to meet the targets through national measures up to then, and if we are then using offsets, international offsets, in order to meet the target, that means that the burden to meet the next target of the next commitment period will be even bigger, because our starting point will not be there where we officially landed, including the offsets. The national policy is not as good as that. Therefore, we have to compensate even for that additional part where we have not been able to meet the commitment through national implementation measures. So that shows also very well that offsets help us in short period, but they help us mainly to gain some time. At the end, we will have to achieve everything through national legislation. So we put just the burden forward, but we will have to address that at a later moment as well. With regard to the question of Belgium, or the two questions, the two bodies you were mentioning, they are both federal bodies, the Intergovernmental Sustainable Development Committee and the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate of the federal authorities. And these committees bring together all the different agencies that have an interest in climate change policy. So trade, economic agencies, agriculture agencies, health agencies, all these agencies together come in these committees and discuss and develop the proposals for new legislation and for new policy measures which we are going to present either in Parliament or to the Cabinet. So this is an institution which is also again answering parts of the echoes, bring together all the different interests. It is in the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change of the federal authorities where we are also presenting and discussing also our new NDC, of course, and also our low emission development strategies. So the lead agency is preparing a proposal, and this proposal will then be consulted with all the agencies interested in climate change policies. And then normally, if we get agreement there, it will be forwarded to the Cabinet. Then let me address the remaining question from New Zealand about our efforts with regard to fossil fuel subsidy reforms. I have already alluded to the CO2 levy that was introduced in January 2008 in Switzerland, and it is one of the highest, I think, if not the highest in the world, and there is even potential that it will further increase. But as you may know, Switzerland levies taxes on all fossil fuels. However, there are tax reliefs being granted for specific uses. These are listed in the Mineral Tax Act, and the most important examples are licensed public transport companies, farming machinery, forestry companies, natural stone quarrying companies, and a very unique thing in Switzerland, the fuel for ski slope grooming equipment. But just, I can assure you, these are not the biggest source of CO2 emissions in Switzerland. Recently, the Swiss Federal Authority Audit Office has recommended that the Federal Department of Finance prepares legislative revision to abolish the mineral oil tax refunds in agriculture. So we are working towards reducing also these very limited areas where we are not fully implementing CO2 taxation. Then let me move to the Indian question, the question from India about the impacts of our economic growth. As you have shown on our slide, the economy in Switzerland has continued to grow over this year. So there is certainly not a negative impact on our economic growth. We know, and we are faced with the same challenges as many of our partners, there's always the fear from the economic sector that more ambitious policies will lead to a slowdown of economic growth. So far, I think this has proven that we were able not to be confronted with such a negative side effect. Let me also say that many of these policies, while being perceived perhaps at the beginning as a burden, at the end turned out to be cost savings for the economic sectors. So sometimes something that needs a first investment and therefore is seen as a burden, in the long run is even for the economic sector a benefit. Then on the question of Brazil on biofuels, this is, we know, let me just check with experts. Thank you very much. So thank you for allowing me to talk to our expert. So we have tax exemption for biofuels in Switzerland. At the same time, we have a high standard requirement for biofuels, so you cannot use any biofuels in Switzerland. There are very high standards with regard to sustainability, with regard also to impacts on food production, so they should not have a negative impact on food production, and also with regard to environmental standards. So if biofuels are meeting these standards, they can be used in Switzerland and would be tax exempted, of course. These tax exemptions will come to an end by 2023. But from then on, the CLIC Foundation, that is this foundation that is importing, that is levying the tax on the import of fuel for cars, they will have the right to continue to use biofuels and with a tax exemption. So that is the current policy in place. If you would like to have more specific and more precise answer, then I would suggest that you interact directly with our colleagues. The last question of China about public awareness. Well, we have, of course, public awareness also whereby the main approach is just to have proactive information about the adaptation needs, about the climate policies that we plan that are in place. That is one of the key elements. We have it also at the cantonal level. I think that was shared in the Talanoa dialogue at the COP in Bonn. We had examples how there were competition in schools in order how to draw designs about it. So there is a kind of public awareness raising in Switzerland. But I would say the biggest awareness that is triggered in Switzerland, that is not necessarily by public awareness, but it is just by reality, by mudslides that are taking place, also increasing Switzerland, by challenges, by huge challenges for ski stations, for example, for cable car stations, which are now confronted with the fact, because the permafrost is diminishing, the stability of the territory is diminishing. So these informations about the threats of climate change in Switzerland and abroad are probably the most important element of public awareness raising. Let me then also, just a moment, let me just also pick up two more questions that were raised this morning in ECHO. I think that is also a way of communicating questions, specific questions to parties. We think this assessment is really a tremendously important space. And it is important that we are getting also critical questions and that we are put on the spot, because only like that, through these questions and by learning from each other, are we also able to continue to increase our efforts, something all of us has to do, of course. So one question was how Switzerland would like to plan to incorporate cleaner cars into the Swiss fleets, because the reality is that we are not achieving the targets we are setting ourselves on the cars. With regard to it is, let me be honest, this is a challenge in Switzerland. It is a challenge really to address that issue. There are many reasons to it, and this is a challenge we are still working on. There are several efforts are taken, like, for example, also the levy on transport fuel. There are elements undertaken, but this is probably one of the biggest challenges, because that would also be a measure that would lead to fast emission reduction in Switzerland. The second question was the climate impact of airplanes departing from Switzerland now account for more than 10% of your total emissions when aviation is included. What is your intended approach to addressing aviation emissions? There are three approaches relevant in Switzerland for that. I think first, of course, that is a participation in CORSIA. That is one element. Second, Switzerland is linking the Swiss ETS to the European ETS, and that might include aviation. And thirdly, the Parliament has proposed now the first chamber and has agreed on the levy on airplane tickets, and how these funds will be used, that is still to be discussed. This will still be discussed in the second chamber of Parliament, but these are for the moment the three approaches on which we try to tackle also aviation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Switzerland, for your answers. Dear colleagues, I would like to congratulate you all for actively engaging in very positive discussions, which reflects the true spirit and principles of the IAR process. During this session, 10 Annex I parties have been multilaterally assessed. Parties were actively engaged in these discussions, and the atmosphere in the room has been always constructive and positive. Before I provide some closing remarks, I would like to take up general statements, if any. India.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much. We have been sitting through since morning and listening to all the presentations and all the reports on BUR and also on BR, and very, I think, excellent reports. And we have gone through an excellent review or assessment process. These reports themselves go through a very big review process in each country, and then they are brought out, and then again assessment process happens. So this is really excellent, and I'm surprised sometimes, because I'm also an IPCC author. I'm surprised how does IPCC treats this literature as grey literature. This is coming from the countries. This is having a very detailed and in-depth review process. I'm also a co-editor-in-chief of one of the carbon journal, and the process I know there is very solid, but I think this is none less from that process. I think, I request the Secretariat and the Chair that this should be maybe reported as minutes of the meeting, that IPCC should seriously consider treating these reports, that is national communication, biennial report, biennial update reports, as not as a grey literature, but literature which should be cited in the IPCC reports very clearly. I think that is first point. The second point is a request to the Secretariat I'm making. Now, for developing country parties, non-Annex I parties, we are going to move forward and create maybe transparency reports and then transparency reporting. For that, I think the first thing is the inventory making process, how transparent we can make it. For that, the developing country parties, like an experts in our country, we do not have access to common reporting format. This is extremely strange. And if we don't have access, there is a condition that the country should agree to use this for reporting. Otherwise, the access will not be provided. Why? I don't agree to this point.
We should be given full and complete access. We should be willing to provide. There is only some software change required, very minor change. And you can create a different platform, the same software, CRF tables, because if after 3 years it has to be done, we have to start preparing now itself. The experts have to be, this is the request I'm having to Secretariat. And I also request the chair to record this in the minutes of the meeting. The third point I'm having is also a request, because we have all the emission reporting from 1990 to the latest year when the countries submit their NIRs. Cannot we prepare a cumulative emission assessment, because this report is available, and publish this as a separate document? So this is my second request, our second request to the Secretariat. And again, I request the chair appropriately to report these three in the minutes of the meeting as you deem appropriate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, India. The Secretariat has kept good note of all your requests. Dear colleagues, we are encouraged to see that developed countries are in general making good progress to meet their 2020 targets. Many parties, as a matter of fact, refer to the targets for 2030 and beyond, and this demonstrates that the short-term 2020 targets are stepping stones to reach the mid-term and long-term targets. Over the last two meetings, we heard that many parties have released ambitious goals for carbon neutrality by 2050. These goals are very welcomed. Parties emphasized innovative climate actions such as emission trading and carbon and energy taxes, which are delivering by far the most significant emission reductions. They also raised significant funding and sent important price signals regarding the use of fossil fuels. They have also emphasized on significant growth in renewable energy production, with additional future increases highlighted, including through competitive tendering and other new structures. Novel approaches to tackling transportation emissions, such as free transit and inclusion of road fuel into emissions trading systems, as well as support for electric vehicles. The phase-out of high carbon fuels, including the decommissioning of coal power plants, and prohibiting the installation of oil heating in new buildings. Energy efficiency targets and programs, including efficiency standards for both new and existing buildings. Participating parties, through their questions, showed a significant interest in methods for reducing HFC and F-gas emissions, on which many of the presenting parties were able to share knowledge. Parties also presented their efforts and plans on adaptation, thus demonstrating the commitment to this direction as well. Parties also expressed interest in learning about the presenting parties' methods and institutional arrangements for evaluating the effectiveness of policies and measures. Parties expressed their support for the multilateral assessment process, as well as the IAR review process, and discussed the knowledge sharing and capacity building benefits of the participation in it. Finally, it should be noted that the openness and honesty of the presentations and discussions during the two sessions has reaffirmed that an effective transparency framework is essential to build trust, understanding and confidence towards delivering ambitious climate goals. Colleagues, I would like now to remind you that the individual party record for each of the 10 parties that have been multilateral assessed during this session will be made available on the respective party webpage. Before I close, India wants to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Not last, but or the least, but on behalf of all the participants, I wanted to invite you as well as all others in this room to give a round of applause for a very sincere, honest and very nice presentation to all the presenters. So join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thank you, India. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I will now close the third working group session of the multilateral assessment under the third cycle of the international assessment and review process. Thank you very much for your presence and your contributions.